6 hours. That is how long an Iranian-flagged cargo ship called the Touska sat in the Gulf of Oman, ignoring warning after warning from a United States Navy destroyer, before America decided it was done asking nicely. What happened next was captured on video, confirmed by U.S. Central Command, and posted by the President of the United States himself. And it marked the moment the blockade of Iran stopped being a diplomatic gesture and became something the whole world had to take seriously. This is the story of how the U.S. Navy enforced a blockade on one of the most contested waterways on Earth, what it actually did to stop a ship in its tracks, and what has happened in the months since, right up through this week. Everything you're about to hear is drawn from confirmed statements by U.S. Central Command, reporting from NPR, NBC News, Stars and Stripes, CNN, and The Hill, along with the President's own public statements, where something is disputed or unconfirmed, that will be said plainly, not glossed over. To understand why a single ship interception became such a big moment, you have to go back to how this all started. In late February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise campaign against Iran, striking military and government sites and, according to multiple confirmed reports, killing Iran's supreme leader and a number of senior officials in the opening hours. That campaign was codenamed Operation Epic Fury, and it triggered what analysts now simply call the 2026 Iran War. In the months that followed, the fighting moved through phases of open conflict, temporary ceasefires, and renewed escalation, with the Strait of Hormuz sitting at the center of almost every one of them. The strait is barely 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through it. Whoever controls passage through the Strait of Hormuz effectively controls a lever on the global economy, and both Washington and Tehran have understood that from day one. By April, ceasefire talks in Islamabad had collapsed. According to CENTCOM, the United States responded on April 13, 2026, by imposing a full naval blockade on Iranian ports, blocking vessels from entering or leaving Iranian waters. Iran, for its part, said it viewed the arrival of U.S. warships near the strait as a direct breach of the ceasefire that had just been negotiated, and vowed to respond. Within days, Iran said it had moved to close the strait entirely in retaliation for the U.S. refusing to lift the blockade. This was the atmosphere the Tusca sailed into. According to CENTCOM's official statement and reporting from NPR, the Tusca, an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel already under U.S. Treasury sanctions for what officials described as a history of illegal shipping activity, was tracked moving through the Gulf of Oman at roughly 17 knots, heading toward the southern Iranian port city of Bandar Abbas. U.S. forces issued repeated warnings over the course of 6 hours, ordering the ship to stop and submit to boarding under the terms of the blockade. The crew did not comply. At that point, the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Spruance moved in. President Trump described what happened next in a post on Truth Social, later corroborated by CENTCOM's own account. The Spruance opened fire on the Tusca's engine room, disabling the vessel where it sat in the water. In the president's own words, the Navy stopped them right in their tracks by blowing a hole in the engine room. CENTCOM described the action as deliberate, professional, and proportional, aimed at compelling compliance rather than destroying the ship outright. What followed looked more like a scene from a military thriller than a routine customs stop. CENTCOM released footage showing Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, a rapid response force of roughly 2,500 Marines and sailors that had recently arrived in the Middle East from its home base in Japan, departing an amphibious assault ship by helicopter, flying out over the Arabian Sea, and rappelling directly down onto the disabled Touska's deck. With the vessel dead in the water and its crew unable to resist, the Marines secured the ship, took its crew into custody, and searched its cargo. The Tusca became the first vessel physically seized by force since the blockade began, and it sent an unmistakable signal. The United States was not bluffing. That interception did not happen in isolation. It came directly on the heels of a broader enforcement effort that CENTCOM says has only intensified since. As of the day the Tusca was boarded, U.S. officials said they had already directed 25 commercial vessels to turn around or return to an Iranian port, rather than attempt to run the blockade. By the following day, that number had risen to 27. According to Reuters and Wikipedia's ongoing tracking of the operation, by mid to late April, the U.S. said it had intercepted a total of 23 vessels, while Lloyd's List, the shipping industry's own tracking service, separately reported that at least 26 ships had managed to slip past the blockade line in both directions during that same window. That gap between the two figures matters because it shows this was never a perfectly sealed wall around Iran's coastline. It was, and still is, a contested, actively resisted enforcement operation, with ships trying to run it in both directions. The scale of the operation itself is significant. CENTCOM has described the blockade as being enforced by more than a dozen warships, over 100 aircraft, and a combined force of Navy sailors, Marines, and Air Force personnel numbering more than 10,000 people. This is not a handful of patrol boats loitering off the coast. It is one of the largest sustained American naval enforcement operations in the Persian Gulf region in years, built specifically to choke off maritime traffic to and from Iran until Tehran meets U.S. demands. Now here is where the story gets more complicated, because the blockade did not stay in place continuously from April onward. According to CNN and multiple wire reports, a ceasefire arrangement was reached at various points during the spring and early summer, and for a period the blockade was eased. But that calm did not hold. President Trump ordered the naval blockade reimposed on July 14, 2026, after a temporary ceasefire expired, and, according to the administration, following continued Iranian strikes against civilian shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, this is not a story that ended in April. It is one that has escalated again in recent weeks, and it is still unfolding as this video is being made. Since that mid-July reimposition, CENTCOM has been posting near-daily updates on X. The numbers tell their own story of steady, grinding pressure rather than a single dramatic strike. On August 3rd, CENTCOM said it had redirected 44 commercial vessels since the blockade resumed, along with disabling 2 ships and boarding 2 others. 2 days later, on August 5th, that number had climbed to 48 vessels diverted. By August 8th, CENTCOM reported 53 commercial vessels redirected, and as of August 9th, just 1 day before this script was finalized, CENTCOM announced the tally had reached 55 commercial vessels redirected, with the same 2 ships disabled and 2 boarded holding steady throughout. Throughout this entire stretch, CENTCOM has also emphasized that more than 30 ships carrying humanitarian aid have been allowed to pass through the blockade, a detail the command has repeated in nearly every update, apparently to underline that this is being framed as a targeted economic and military pressure campaign rather than a blanket siege. The hardware behind these numbers is worth understanding too. CENTCOM's own posts and reporting from outlets covering naval deployments describe more than 20 U.S. warships currently deployed to the region in support of the blockade, including the destroyer USS Ross and the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, whose strike group includes F/A-18E Super Hornets and F-35C stealth fighters. CENTCOM has posted footage of F-35Cs launching from the Lincoln's deck as the carrier transits the Arabian Sea, explicitly tying that air power to blockade enforcement. This is a multi-domain operation, destroyers doing the physical interceptions at sea, a carrier strike group providing air cover and deterrence overhead, and thousands of personnel coordinating it all from ships and shore commands across the region. So, what is Iran actually saying about all of this? According to CNN's reporting from earlier this week, Iran's position has remained consistent and, from Tehran's perspective, non-negotiable. Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, published a list of conditions through state media that he said must be met before Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Those conditions include lifting the U.S. naval blockade entirely, a full withdrawal of American military forces from the region, a permanent end to the war, compensation for war damages, and the release of frozen Iranian financial assets. Until America corrects its behavior, Zolgadar's statement read, the Strait of Hormuz will not be reopened. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, has separately criticized the U.S. for what he described as undermining Iran's own management of the strait by establishing alternative transit routes protected by the U.S. Navy rather than working through Iran's proposed arrangements. At the same time, and this is a detail that complicates any simple narrative of total confrontation, CNN reported on August 8th that Iran and Oman appear close to a deal that would allow ships to transit the Strait of Hormuz via a temporary route, with both countries later working out a permanent replacement for the historic traffic separation scheme that vessels used before the war began. Oman's government described the talks as constructive, but warned that continued Iranian attacks on vessels in the strait were threatening to derail progress. So even as Iran publicly refuses to negotiate directly with Washington on its own terms, it appears to be working a parallel diplomatic channel through Oman to manage the practical reality of the strait, staying at least partially open. Then there is President Trump's own rhetoric, which has swung between warnings of further escalation and expressions of restraint. On August 2nd, addressing reporters, Trump said he wanted to give Iran every last chance before decapitation, describing it as a major decision to consider an attack of that scale against a country. He went on to say that Iran had reportedly reached out asking him not to attack, promising instead to make a deal, and that he was acting at the request of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and, according to him, Iran itself, to hold off military action. Trump also said he was not operating under any fixed deadline to resolve the conflict, framing his approach as giving Iran room to, in his words, let a lot of people live. Whether that framing is diplomatic leverage, genuine restraint, or something in between is a matter of interpretation. But the quotes themselves are directly sourced to his public remarks as reported by outlets covering the story in real time. Not every development in this story is confirmed, and it is worth being upfront about that. On August 3rd, a Liberia-flagged, Greek-managed bulk carrier was struck roughly 20 nautical miles northeast of the Omani port city of Kasab. According to tracking through early August, the vessel remained under salvage operations, with its third engineer still unaccounted for. No group has claimed responsibility for that strike, and no government, not the United States, not Iran, has issued a formal attribution. That is an important distinction from the Touska incident, where the attacking party, the reasoning, and the outcome were all confirmed on the record by CENTCOM and the President directly. The Kasab strike remains an open question, and any channel or account claiming to know for certain who was behind it is going beyond what has actually been verified. There is also a broader economic dimension to this standoff that is easy to lose amid the military details. According to figures cited by U.S. officials and reported across multiple outlets, the blockade has been estimated to cost Iran as much as $500 million a day in blocked trade and disrupted port activity. Earlier reporting cited by Wikipedia's tracking of the operation put the total intercepted vessel count at 85 according to CENTCOM at one point, alongside Iran seizing 2 cargo ships of its own in a retaliatory move, a reminder that this pressure campaign has run in both directions, not just one. Global shipping interests have taken notice of the toll as well. 8 of the world's largest shipping associations sent a joint letter to United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the head of the International Maritime Organization on August 3rd, made public 2 days later, urging the UN to oppose any Iranian toll regime on ships transiting the strait, arguing it would violate international navigational norms and damage the global economy. That letter is a signal of just how far beyond the US and Iran this standoff now reaches. It is shaping conversations in Geneva and London boardrooms, not just in Washington and Tehran. It's also worth pausing on why Bandar Abbas specifically keeps coming up throughout this story. Bandar Abbas is Iran's largest port city, sitting right at the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz, and it functions as the country's primary gateway for both imports and oil exports. When the Tusca was heading toward Bandar Abbas at 17 knots before it was disabled, it wasn't heading toward some minor coastal town. It was making for the single most important port in the entire Iranian blockade equation. Nearly every CENTCOM update about vessels being redirected, disabled, or boarded ultimately connects back to traffic trying to reach or leave Bandar Abbas, which is exactly why the U.S. Navy has concentrated so much of its firepower. Destroyers, a full carrier strike group over 100 aircraft, in the waters immediately surrounding that single choke point. Control the approaches to Bandar Abbas, and you control the practical reality of whether Iran's blockade-era economy can function at all. The humanitarian carve-out in all of this deserves a closer look too, because it's one of the more consistent details CENTCOM has repeated across nearly every single update since mid-July. Even as the command has touted redirecting 55 commercial vessels and disabling or boarding others, it has just as consistently emphasized that more than 30 ships carrying humanitarian aid have been allowed to pass through the blockade unimpeded. That distinction matters for how the operation is being framed publicly. CENTCOM appears to be making a deliberate effort to signal that this is a targeted pressure campaign aimed at commercial and potentially military-linked shipping, not a blanket humanitarian siege of the Iranian population. Whether that framing holds up to independent scrutiny over time, particularly if the blockade drags on for months, is something worth watching closely, rather than simply taking at face value. It's also worth stepping back and asking what success would even look like for either side at this point. For the United States, the stated goal appears to be forcing Iran back to the negotiating table on American terms, full transparency, an end to attacks on shipping, and presumably some resolution on the broader issues that triggered Operation Epic Fury in the first place. Every CENTCOM update, every redirected vessel, every disabled ship is really a data point in that pressure campaign, not an end in itself. For Iran, based on Zolgader's public demands, success looks like the complete reversal of the blockade. A full American troop withdrawal, compensation, and the unfreezing of assets. In other words, something close to total American capitulation. Given how far apart those two positions are, it's not surprising that the practical action on the ground has moved not toward Washington and Tehran talking directly, but toward the side channel with Oman, where a narrower, more achievable outcome, a temporary transit route through the strait, appears to be within reach, even while the larger political standoff remains frozen. That gap between the sweeping political demands on both sides and the narrower, more practical Oman-brokered shipping arrangement is probably the most important thing to watch going forward. Wars and blockades of this scale rarely end with one side fully backing down to the other's complete list of demands. They tend to end, or at least pause, through exactly the kind of narrower technical arrangement Oman appears to be brokering. A temporary transit scheme that lets global shipping resume in some form without either Washington or Tehran having to formally declare that it got everything it wanted. If that Oman deal does move forward in the coming weeks, It could end up mattering more for how this actually plays out day to day than anything said in a CENTCOM press release or a Truth Social post. So where does that leave the Strait of Hormuz today in the second week of August 2026? On one hand, you have an American naval force of more than 20 warships, a full carrier strike group, and over 10,000 personnel enforcing a blockade that has now redirected 55 commercial vessels and physically boarded and disabled others, with the Touska seizure back in April standing as the clearest example of just how far the U.S. Navy is willing to go to make that blockade stick. On the other hand, you have an Iranian government publicly refusing to negotiate on Washington's terms, while simultaneously working a side channel through Oman that could reopen at least partial shipping traffic without American involvement at all. And hovering over both of those tracks is a president who has floated the word decapitation. In the same week, he described extending Iran every last chance, in a strait that remains one of unattributed attack away from a much bigger crisis. To really understand why the Tusca incident carried so much weight, it helps to look at how the war itself began, because this was never a conflict that started at sea. According to the Wikipedia-tracked timeline of the war and multiple confirmed news reports from the time, the opening moves came on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise campaign against Iran under the American codename Operation Epic Fury. At 20:38 UTC that day, President Trump gave the order to proceed. And just hours later at 06:35 UTC, CENTCOM publicly announced that it and partner forces had begun airstrikes against Iranian targets. Those strikes hit military and government sites across the country, and in the opening hours of the campaign, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed, along with a number of other senior Iranian officials. Before the strikes even began, according to reporting at the time, then U.S. Envoy Mike Huckabee had emailed embassy staff warning that if they wanted to leave the region, they should do so immediately. A small but telling detail suggesting Washington knew exactly how dramatically the situation was about to change. That opening campaign is what set every later development, including the Strait of Hormuz blockade, into motion. A war that began with strikes on leadership targets in Tehran ended up, months later, being fought just as intensely over cargo manifests and shipping lanes in the Gulf of Oman. It's also worth understanding exactly what legal and procedural framework the Navy says it is operating under, because this is not simply American warships firing at will. CENTCOM has repeatedly framed the blockade in terms of the international legal doctrine known as right of visit and search, which allows a belligerent naval power to stop, board, and inspect vessels suspected of breaching a declared blockade. In one broadcast, captured on video and confirmed by CENTCOM, a U.S. helicopter crew can be heard warning nearby vessels directly over the radio. This blockade of Iranian ports will be enforced and applies to all vessels, regardless of flag. Any vessel with further intent to enter, exit an Iranian port will be subject to the right of visit and search in accordance with international law. If you attempt to run the blockade, we will compel compliance with force. Over. That warning, delivered before the Tusca was ever fired upon, is part of why CENTCOM has consistently described its actions as deliberate, professional, and proportional, rather than an unprovoked attack. The Navy's position is that every vessel gets fair warning in plain language before force is used. The ship that carried out the Touska interception is itself worth a closer look, because it says something about the kind of force the United States chose to use for this mission. The USS Spruance is an Arleigh Burke-class Aegis-guided missile destroyer, commissioned back in 2011, and it carries a substantial mix of weapon systems: Tomahawk cruise missiles for long-range strike, close-in guns, torpedoes, and even directed energy laser systems for close-quarters defense. Sending a warship with that level of capability to physically disable a single cargo vessel was, in effect, a statement in itself. The United States was not sending a lightly armed patrol boat to handle enforcement. It was putting a top-tier destroyer on the line, specifically, so there would be no question about whether the Navy could back up its warnings. The unit that actually boarded the Tusca after it was disabled tells a similar story. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit is a rapid response amphibious force based out of Japan, built specifically to deploy quickly into crisis zones and conduct exactly this kind of operation: helicopter-borne assaults, vessel boardings, and small-scale direct action. According to CENTCOM, the unit numbers roughly 2,500 Marines and sailors, and it had only recently arrived in the Middle East when the Touska operation happened, redeployed from the Indo-Pacific specifically to support blockade enforcement. Watching Marines rappel out of a helicopter onto a disabled cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman is the kind of image that circulated widely because it looked almost cinematic. But according to CENTCOM's own account, it was a textbook execution of a boarding operation this unit trains for constantly. The discrepancy between CENTCOM's numbers and Lloyd's List's independent tracking is worth dwelling on a little longer too, because it matters for anyone trying to judge how effective this blockade actually is. CENTCOM, as the U.S. military's own command, has every incentive to report vessel interceptions, in a way that emphasizes enforcement success. Lloyd's List, by contrast, is a commercial shipping industry publication that tracks vessel movements independently for insurers, ship owners, and traders who need accurate information regardless of who looks good in the process. When Lloyd's List reported that at least 26 ships had bypassed the blockade line by April 20th, even as CENTCOM was citing a total of 23 vessels intercepted around the same period, it underlined a basic truth about naval blockades in a choke point as narrow and heavily trafficked as the Strait of Hormuz. No blockade of this kind has ever been perfectly airtight, and this one is no exception. Ships have used a mix of flag changes, transponder manipulation, and simple timing to attempt to slip through, even as U.S. warships and aircraft maintain a near-continuous presence. There is also a wider diplomatic backdrop that shaped how the blockade came to be reimposed in the first place. Back when the Islamabad talks were still underway earlier in the conflict, the U.S. delegation sent to negotiate directly with Iranian officials included Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, and a senior advisor, a delegation signaling how seriously the administration was treating the possibility of ending the war through negotiation rather than force. According to reporting from that period, Iran's government ultimately declined to join those talks, with Iran's state news agency IRNA confirming the decision. That collapse in Islamabad is directly what CENTCOM cited as the trigger for the original blockade imposition on April 13th. A reminder that the entire naval campaign that followed, including the Touska seizure, grew directly out of a failed diplomatic track, rather than being the administration's first move. The economic pressure campaign has not existed in a vacuum either. According to a Forbes report from earlier this month, the broader war has reportedly depleted significant portions of Iran's military weapons stockpiles, a claim President Trump has publicly denied, insisting Iran's capabilities remain intact. That dispute matters because it shapes how much leverage each side believes it actually has heading into any negotiation. If Iran's stockpiles genuinely are strained, Tehran has a much stronger incentive to seek a negotiated end to the blockade sooner rather than later. If Trump's denial is closer to the truth, then Iran may have more room to simply wait the pressure out. Neither claim has been independently verified with hard evidence at the time of this recording, so it's presented here as a live, contested claim rather than settled fact. Iran's domestic situation has also drawn international attention during this same window. According to Iran Human Rights, an independent monitoring organization, and reporting picked up by UN News, Iran recorded a sharp spike in executions in recent weeks, with at least 444 executions documented in the country so far in 2026, including 71 in July alone. The United Nations flagged the spike as a serious human rights concern. That statistic is not directly a Navy or blockade story, but it forms part of the wider picture of a country under significant internal and external strain simultaneously, fighting a naval blockade in the Strait of Hormuz while facing separate scrutiny over its human rights record at home. Reactions from outside the U.S.-Iran conflict itself have also started shaping the conversation. According to reporting on the Hormuz standoff, China's leadership has weighed in publicly, with President Xi Jinping stating that normal passage through the Strait of Hormuz serves the common interests of regional countries and the broader international community, a comment widely read as an indirect call for the U.S. to ease the blockade, given how much Chinese trade and oil imports depend on that route staying open. China has not taken direct military action in the dispute, but its economic stake in Gulf shipping gives its diplomatic statements real weight. And it's a reminder that even though this story centers on Washington and Tehran, the ripple effects extend to nearly every major economy that depends on Gulf oil. The ripple effects on global shipping and insurance markets are also part of this story, even if they get less attention than the military footage. A blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, regardless of who is enforcing it, tends to push up war risk insurance premiums for any vessel transiting the area, which in turn raises shipping costs that get passed down the supply chain to fuel prices and consumer goods well beyond the Middle East. That's part of why the joint letter from 8 major shipping associations to the United Nations carried real weight in trade circles. It wasn't just a symbolic protest. It was an attempt by the industry that actually moves the world's oil and cargo to get ahead of a toll regime or prolonged closure before it reshapes global shipping routes and costs for months or years to come. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about exactly where this information comes from and what remains unresolved. The confirmed details in this video: the Tusca interception, the blockade's start and reimposition dates, the daily CENTCOM vessel redirection figures through August 9th, Iran's stated demands through Zulgadar, and the Oman negotiations are all drawn from CENTCOM's own public statements, President Trump's on-the-record remarks, and reporting from NPR, NBC News, Stars and Stripes, CNN, The Hill, and Reuters' sourced tracking of the operation. What remains unverified or contested includes the exact death toll and damage figures from earlier phases of the war, the total number of ships that have successfully evaded the blockade versus official CENTCOM tallies, and, as already noted, responsibility for the August 3rd strike on the bulk carrier near Kasab. Any of those details you hear elsewhere presented as settled fact should be treated with caution unless they trace back to a named source. It's worth remembering, too, that this is not the first time in modern history the Strait of Hormuz has been at the center of a major standoff, even if the scale and technology involved this time are unlike anything seen before. The strait has been a flashpoint for decades, given its sheer importance to global oil flows, but what makes the current situation genuinely distinct is the combination of factors now stacked on top of each other at once. A war that opened with the killing of a country's supreme leader, a formal U.S. naval blockade enforced by a full carrier strike group and stealth aircraft, near-daily public accounting of enforcement numbers on social media, a parallel and increasingly serious diplomatic track running through a third country in Oman, and a U.S. president publicly floating a word as extreme as decapitation, while simultaneously describing his own restraint. Very few choke point standoffs in recent memory have combined all of those elements simultaneously, which is part of why this story has held global attention for months, rather than fading after the initial airstrikes back in February. For anyone trying to track where this goes next, there are a small number of concrete things worth watching, rather than speculating about. First, whether the Iran-Oman transit deal that CNN reported as nearing completion on August 8th actually gets finalized and implemented, because that would represent the first practical functioning alternative to the current standoff, regardless of what happens with the larger political dispute between Washington and Tehran. Second, whether CENTCOM's daily vessel redirection numbers keep climbing at the same pace they have through early August, which would suggest the blockade is holding and possibly tightening, or whether that pace levels off, which could suggest either declining attempts to run the blockade or a quiet loosening of enforcement. Third, whether any government or group ever claims responsibility for the August 3rd strike near Kasab, because an attack of that nature going unclaimed and unattributed for an extended period is itself a sign of how unstable and unpredictable this specific stretch of water has become, with multiple armed actors operating in overlapping waters and no reliable way for outside observers to know for certain who fired first in any given incident. What is not in question is this. The Strait of Hormuz, this narrow stretch of water separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula, has become the single most closely watched choke point on the planet, and the U.S. Navy has already shown with the Touska exactly what it is prepared to do when a ship refuses to stop. Whether the coming weeks bring a negotiated reopening of the strait through the Oman Channel, a further escalation toward the kind of action Trump has hinted at, or another prolonged standoff of redirected tankers and diplomatic posturing, is genuinely not something anyone can predict with confidence right now. And any video that tells you otherwise is speculating, not reporting. So here's the honest question worth sitting with. Given everything you've just heard, the blockade numbers climbing week over week, Iran's refusal to negotiate directly with Washington while quietly working through Oman, and a president talking about decapitation and one last chance in the same breath, do you think this ends in a negotiated reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, or in another round of direct confrontation? And if you found this breakdown useful, it's worth keeping an eye on the Oman Channel specifically over the next few weeks, since that quieter diplomatic track, far away from Truth Social posts and CENTCOM press releases, may end up shaping daily life in the Strait of Hormuz more than anything said publicly by either Washington or Tehran. Let us know in the comments what you think happens next. Thanks for watching.